Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, The Affordable City, Supply, Stability, and Subsidy, Lessons Since 2020, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network and Island Press. My name is Jill Lemke. I serve as the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning. I also serve as a member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working toward a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous communities for all. In addition to hosting webinars, we provide information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. The Smart Growth Network website is currently going through a transition, so please stay tuned for updated Smart Growth news and content. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov or by visiting our YouTube channel. The Planning Department's website also provides valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities, and includes links to past and future webinars. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speaker are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the state of Maryland, or the Smart Growth Network. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To receive your credits, visit the APA's website, planning.org, to log into your account and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for the event number 928-5860. Following the presentation, we will address as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time using the questions box on the control panel on your right-hand side of the screen. Our speaker for today is Shane Phillips. Shane Phillips manages the Randall Lewis Housing Initiative within UCLA's Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies. In this role, he supports faculty and student research, manages events, and publishes research, policy briefs, and educational materials. His work covers a wide range of housing topics, including tenant protections, housing production policies, and government revenue and financing reforms. Shane is also the author of The Affordable City, Strategies for Putting Housing Within Reach and Keeping It There, in which he argues for an all of the above approach to housing policy and outlines 55 strategies for improving affordability and housing stability. Welcome, Shane, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jill, for hosting me. It's great to be back here a little over 3 years since my first presentation and since the book came out in 2020. I'm just saying hi on video here briefly, but I'm going to go back off video once I get into the presentation. I should clarify, this is going to be sort of, partly a rehash of the presentation I gave way back when, with certainly, some revisions that have occurred over time. This is not just lessons since 2020, it's and lessons since 2020. So hopefully people were not misled in that regard. But I think the goal here is sort of to cover a lot of what is in the book and its intent and contents, but then also reflect a little bit on how my thinking has changed, what, where the research has gone as well in the years since it was published. So I'm going to go back off of video here and share my screen. And I think we're in good shape. Is this just showing the presentation only?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So my name is Shane Phillips, and yeah, I work at the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at UCLA. I've been here for about 4.5 years. And, in addition to that, I do some writing, I do some consulting on housing issues, and I wrote this book, The Affordable City, it came out in September 2020, so it's been more than 3 years now, and certainly housing has only become more top of mind for a lot of folks and cities and states and then the federal government as well. And I guess I should say, just to start things off, that the book is available from Island Press, and you can actually get a 30% off discount code with the code SMART if you'd like to purchase it there. You can maybe wait until the end of the presentation to make that decision, but I hope you I hope you decide to do it. Ultimately, though, I think you can get a lot of the messages here, and really what this is going to be about is sorry, I'm getting a little flustered here because my presentation is not working. One sec. Okay, is the slides actually moving on now?
Yes, sorry, they're moving.
Perfect. I appreciate it. All right, so I did want to share also, in addition to the book, since 2021, about 6 months after the book came out, we started a podcast, and this is produced at the UCLA Lewis Center. Every 2 weeks, we interview a researcher on some housing topic, usually a peer-reviewed study, sometimes a report or a book that they've published. And the goal of this really is to share what is being learned and what has oftentimes been known for quite a while in academia that is not usually super accessible to folks outside of academia, whether because a peer-reviewed journal is inaccessible, you have to pay for it or have an academic account to access them. It's also, they just tend to be very in the weeds and technical. And so our goal really is to discuss a lot of that research, what it means, what it says, implications for policy, and bring that to a broader audience of planners, of advocates, of elected officials. There are now 67 episodes, each a little over an hour. So we've got over 70 hours of content there, and you can actually earn credit for listening as of about a year ago. So every one of those episodes is eligible for credit at 1 credit per hour. So very much encourage folks to listen. And a lot of the things I'm going to discuss today have actually come up and we go into in much greater detail in the podcast. All of that said, discussing the book itself. So similar to the presentation I gave here a few years ago, I want to talk a little bit about the motivation for the book and about these key themes of supply, stability, and subsidy, but then get into some things that we've learned since 2020, as I said. The book itself is really two things. It is an argument for a comprehensive and holistic approach to housing policy that includes these priorities of supply, stability, and subsidy, these 3 S's. And it is a handbook of policies and strategies to consider when you're in a position to enact or advocate for these kinds of reforms. I'd like to actually open this presentation in the same way I opened my book and the same way I opened that earlier presentation for the Smart Growth webinar, which is with a quick case study on a development proposal here in Los Angeles that goes by the name of Yucca Argyle, just based on the cross streets. This is in Hollywood, just a block or two from Hollywood Boulevard. The project itself is 200 new units. It includes 40 that are reserved for low-income households, and it's being built on private land with private funding. No subsidies involved in this whatsoever. I would guess that at a market rate, 1-bedroom unit in this building probably rents for a minimum of $2,500 a month. Los Angeles is quite expensive, but those 40 income restricted units in this building will rent for closer to $800, $1,000 a month, maybe $1,100, $1,200, depending on the size. And even compared to a 50, 70, 100-year-old apartment building in Hollywood, this is a very, very good deal, probably a 30 to 50% discount. And that comparison to these older buildings is important because this project would actually be replacing one of those older buildings and a fairly big one of 40 units. So if you're looking at this from a high level, which is frankly how I would have looked at this project from 5 or 6 years ago, this is objectively a good trade, just kind of the net impact of this. You're taking 40 rent stabilized units, most of which are probably have rents in the $1,200 to $1,500 per month range, or did at the time I wrote this book at least, maybe more. And you're replacing those 40 units with really 1-for-1 with 40 income restricted units, deed restricted income below market units, renting for, in many cases, under $1,000 per month. Those units will remain affordable for at least 55 years because of laws in California, whereas rent stabilized units have many fewer protections and aren't nearly as affordable over the medium to long term. On top of that, you're getting 160 market rate units, which is going to help absorb growing demand and stabilize prices across the market. You're helping densify this neighborhood. You're creating new tax revenues. You're building this right next to the Red Line subway station. So it's good for environment and mobility. And yet, the people who lived in this 40-unit rent-stabilized building that was to be torn down, they put together a really large and quite effective protest against the project. And although I can see the big picture benefits of this project, I can also absolutely understand their opposition, and I want to explain why. So the problem arises when we shift our frame from that big picture, citywide, region-wide lens, and we start to look at individual households. So yes, the rent stabilized units would be replaced by more affordable and longer term below market units. And that is a great thing. But these tenants, by and large, would not be the ones to benefit. Some would earn too little to be eligible for the new low income units. Many more most likely would earn too much. And even the people who did fall within that right income band would be competing with hundreds, if not thousands, of other applicants for those 40 units. The rent stabilized tenants would be evicted, and they might receive as much as $20,000 in relocation payments. But I think you can all do the math on how far that will take you if you're paying, say, $800 a month in a rent stabilized unit, you're on a fixed income, and now you're back on the market where a comparable unit is going for $1,500 or more per month. $20,000, as much as it is not adequate compensation for that loss. So of course, the tenants are going to oppose a project like this. And that doesn't make them NIMBYs. This isn't people complaining about relatively minor kind of quality of life issues like neighborhood character or parking, those kinds of things. These are people who will be made just, irrefutably and very strongly worse off, and ultimately for someone else's benefit. The fact is, the main beneficiaries here are not developers. It's really the future residents of that new building, and to an extent, the city as a whole, for the impact of just that additional supply. But that is not going to convince any of these tenants that they should be the ones to bear this burden on someone else's behalf. And I think, again, I think they're completely justified in taking that position. My main takeaway from this story is that depending on your perspective, you can see this as a purely bad or purely good project. And within the confines of either a regional or individual perspective, you would probably be right to see it that way. But we can't confine ourselves to one perspective or another. The region-wide benefits really do matter here, and we need to take those into account. Cities all over the US absolutely need more housing, a lot more housing. But those regional benefits can't be the only thing that we concern ourselves with. We also need to be concerned with how individual people and individual households are affected. And for those focused on the tenants, the reverse is also true. The regional benefits matter, and we have to recognize that the status quo imposes its own costs, and those also tend to fall on the most disadvantaged. So just doing nothing is not a solution here. I don't think anyone listening will find it controversial when I say that in housing, we often find ourselves in factions. We are either pro-tenant or we're pro-housing, and identifying with one is often interpreted as opposition to the other. But again, I really think this is more about perspective, and these positions are not actually contradictory. The realization that they were not contradictory was sort of the genesis of this book. I think what we see is that, on the one hand, the stereotypical pro-housing advocate, YIMBY, looks at a project like the Yucca Argyle, and they focus on this question of who benefits. And the stereotypical tenant advocate sees it and asks the question of who is harmed. The real message of my book, and a through line for my advocacy and a lot of my research, is that we all need to be asking both of these questions, and that only when we do that will we get better policy and stronger partnerships to actually enact that policy. Something I didn't really come to realize until well after writing this book is that I was doing something that President Eisenhower, a very long time ago, or at least an apocryphal version of him, referred to as enlarging the problem. So this quote, "If you can't solve a problem, enlarge it." He wasn't talking about housing with this quote, as you can imagine, but the basic idea here, as applied to housing, is that just like everything else in the modern world, these systems are complicated, and trying to solve one problem will always create some kind of problem elsewhere. There are always unintended consequences. We can try, and we should try, to design our policies and programs to minimize those unintended consequences. But that's not always enough. Sometimes you have to tackle those unintended consequences with their own intervention. You have to enlarge the problem, working not just to solve the core initial issue you were interested in, but also the other kind of downstream problems that can arise from the solution itself. Just as an example, if permitting more housing raises concerns about gentrification and displacement, and I think it rightly should be something we are concerned with, the solution here is not to just permit less housing. We need the housing. It's, again, to tackle those unintended consequences head on, both in the ways that we encourage development and with protections and mitigations against harm, and finding ways for those things to coexist. So if you're worried that upzoning to encourage more diverse and affordable housing types will lead to displacement, again, something we should be attentive to, you don't stop the upzoning. Instead, you can do things like pairing it with displacement protections and mitigations, upzoning more broadly so that redevelopment is not concentrated to just a few neighborhoods, encouraging development on parcels that don't already have multifamily buildings, which is contrary to how we have tended to do things historically, because places that have multifamily housing and multifamily zoning tend to be poorer. They tend to be disproportionately communities of color. And so we've targeted development there because of the lack of power in those communities. And that's something we can choose not to do in the future. On the flip side, if you're worried that policies like rent stabilization or eviction protections will suppress the supply of housing, that's good. You should be concerned because those policies have been shown to do that in many cases, depending on how they're designed. But instead of opposing that protection, which benefits real people in real ways, we can consider pairing those protections with upzoning to create capacity elsewhere. We can increase the speed and certainty of housing approvals so that even if there is some downside cost to those protections, there's this offsetting benefit. We can design the policies in ways that minimize the impacts overall, like exempting new units from rent stabilization for their first 15 or 20 years. These are all options for making these things work together rather than at odds, or having the strengths of one complement the weaknesses of another. The framework that I use to talk about this in my book, and how I ultimately enlarged this problem of competing narratives and interests, is these 3 S's of supply, stability, and subsidy. They can really be boiled down to building enough housing of all types and for all types of people, establishing protections that give renters and other vulnerable households a strong and morally defensible level of housing security, and providing adequate public funding to help those who lack the resources to afford housing on their own. The reason you need all of these priorities together is because different people need different things, and people's needs change over time as well. The protection and stability you might need today should not stand in the way of new opportunities you might want to be able to take advantage of tomorrow, and it shouldn't have to. It only does, these things are only in opposition when we try to solve all or most of our housing challenges by focusing on one or two of these priorities to the exclusion of the others. Together, each of these policies can be mutually reinforcing, again, with the strengths of one making up for the shortcomings of others. I want to get into supply stability and subsidy just quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on these, but just starting with supply here, fundamentally, making housing supply a priority is about acknowledging that we live in a world of physical and economic constraints, and we cannot wish them away. First, we have the physical constraint that a growing, aging, changing population requires a growing and changing stock of homes. The United States has a serious inequality problem, and that certainly extends to housing as well, but you cannot redistribute your way out of a shortage. With housing, we have a distribution problem and a scarcity problem, and we need solutions to both. We have other ways of addressing distributional issues. Taxes and subsidies tend to be very good for that. But to reduce scarcity, you have to actually build stuff. Then there's the related economic reality that when housing is scarce, homeowners and landlords gain incredible leverage over home buyers and renters, and they're the ones who pay the price. And just to be clear, I think this is pretty well established for most folks at this point, but providing an adequate supply of homes has been a real challenge in the US for quite a few decades now. I find this chart particularly compelling, just showing how the rate of home building has declined in every major metro area from the pre-global financial crisis era to the post-GFC period. Places like Charlotte and Orlando and Dallas built a lot, and then they built a little less. Places like New York and Los Angeles built very little, and then they still built even less somehow in the years following 2008. So we have a lot to make up for here. Looking at kind of a more historical perspective, this is housing production per capita in the US. And you can see, there are ups and downs over the decades, but the very clear trend over time has been just down, down, down. I think analogies can be helpful. So to better understand why supply is so important for affordability, I like to look at another market, the one for used cars. In just 2 years following the outbreak of COVID-19, the price of used cars shot up by 50%, from an average of about $20,000 in January of 2020 to over $30,000 by 2022. As with housing, this rise in prices didn't happen because used cars were suddenly all refitted and reupholstered and they got more expensive because they became nicer. They got more expensive because they became scarcer. New car production declined. Those new cars saw their prices rise as a result, and the impacts very quickly cascaded down to the used car market. The price of used cars is linked to the price and availability of new cars, and the price of used housing is linked to the price and availability of new housing. There are really two big differences between the car market and the housing market in this analogy that I think are salient. First is that we chose to do this to our housing market, unlike the car market. And the second is just how long we've been underbuilding. For cars, it was maybe 3 years or so before things bounced back. For housing, it's been 40 plus, and we're still not back where we used to be or anywhere close. I think a lot of people and places want to reject this reality, and yeah, I understand where this comes from. But they want to reject the importance of supply, the role it plays, and ultimately they want to stop growth. I will say cities all along the coast, including where I'm from, Seattle to some extent, and certainly Los Angeles, where I live now, they have tried this, and we have seen the results. My observation is that you cannot stop growth, at least not in a free society where people are allowed to live where they please. You can really only manage the form that the growth takes. By and large, cities have one of three paths available to them. If people want to live in and move to your city or town, that place can grow its housing stock to accommodate rising demand, a lot of which might just be children being born and growing up in that place. Or you can not build housing, and that rising demand will find another outlet in the form of higher prices. The third option is if you're just not a place where many people want to live, in which case you're probably already stagnating and may already be in decline. Given the choice between these three options, I think number one is the very obvious, clear pick, and the one that has the most potential to leave our kids and grandchildren better off rather than worse. Another way of putting this is this image on the right. You can have a city that is appealing, affordable, and unchanging, but you can only pick two. If it's appealing and unchanging, it's not going to be affordable. You can think of big, expensive cities like New York and San Francisco. If it's unchanging and affordable, it's probably not very appealing. A lot of Rust Belt cities are dealing with this challenge now. And if it's appealing and affordable, it is not going to stay that way for long if it's unchanging, if you don't build more homes and plan for a future with more neighbors. Some policy examples, I should say, the book, in addition to making this argument for supply stability and subsidy, it really, 2/3 of it is essentially a handbook for how you do that. And there are about 55 policies and strategies that are considered and discussed and looked at for case studies to give some guidance for how to advocate for these things, where they may be appropriate, what to look out for in terms of poison pills and ways that these things can compromise other goals. But just to list a few on the supply side, one is building up commercial corridors and centers where residential displacement is unlikely. I should say there are limits to this, and you don't want all of your housing to go in these places because people deserve to live in other less busy locations as well, and kind of quieter and more residential streets, which doesn't just mean single family only. Broadly upzoning much wider swaths of cities to allow missing middle, mid-rise, high-rise, small lots, the whole gamut of housing types. And really, I'll come back to this near the end to really talk about what I mean by this and why it's so important and has been getting a lot more attention in recent years. Making home building a by right process rather than discretionary, which increases certainty and lowers cost. As I like to say, this is really just about doing better, higher quality planning up front. And then once you've done that planning, actually sticking to those plans that you've made instead of bargaining away the rules that you've created. And of course, the classic reducing or eliminating parking minimums, which used to be quite radical, and now literally hundreds of cities have done it. Multiple states have done it. This is no longer a cutting edge policy. It's just an old hat. Moving on to stability. Once again, this is about protecting vulnerable households and marginalized communities and protecting deed restricted or other low cost housing too. But I think to compare this to supply in a more philosophical way, which I think is appropriate, if supply is about acknowledging just the economic and physical constraints in the housing market, then stability is about acknowledging our moral obligations. It's about asking the question of how we ensure some minimum level of dignity and security for every household, whether they rent or own. The answer to how we provide that dignity in most U.S. jurisdictions right now is that if you want that security, go buy a home. But that's never been viable for a lot of people, both just for cost and class reasons, but also like systemic and interpersonal racism and violence. There's, I think you all know the stories here. But, beyond the fact that homeownership has never been viable for many people, it's getting even more difficult because of our poor performance on supply in particular. And it really should not be necessary anyhow. It should not be the case that you have to own a home to know where you're going to live a year from now. We can and we should do better. What does stability policy look like? There's a lot of different forms that this can take. I think rent stabilization is a really key and central one. Again, the design of these policies really makes a difference, but this is about providing some level of security and predictability where people know next year my rent may go up, but it can't go up by more than 3%, 5%, whatever it happens to be. Importantly, this also does need to be paired with some kind of eviction protections where people can only be evicted for cause or for only very limited no cause reasons. Otherwise, the purpose of this policy is completely eroded. Limiting lower yield redevelopments. This is the kind of situation where you might replace a 4-unit apartment building with a 5 or a 3-unit apartment building. These are just not very, these are not improving affordability in most cases. We need to have policies in place that are actually, on the zoning, on the supply side, allowing for considerably higher densities, but on the regulation side, actually preventing some of these cases where you're actually losing affordable housing and not really gaining much in its place. And something that I think has gotten more attention, especially in recent years, and rightfully so, is requiring either negotiated buyouts or right of return for displaced households when new development comes in. This does increase the cost of development, but again, this can be offset by allowing sufficiently dense replacement projects. It's only when you're doing, say, replacing a duplex with a fourplex that the costs of these things becomes prohibitive. Finally, again, subsidy is about filling gaps in supply and stability policies where money is the best tool, as it often is. It's about investing in affordable or social or public housing, whatever nomenclature you prefer and whatever is appropriate for your community. It's about investing in rent assistance and shelters and services. It's about helping people in need of help, whether that help is needed briefly during a difficult time or for much longer, either permanently or for months or years at a time when appropriate. But it is also about designing taxes and fees to do double duty where possible, not only generating revenues to support the kinds of housing needs I've just talked about, but also incentivizing behaviors that improve housing conditions indirectly. And I'll just give some examples of that. So some subsidy policies, progressive real estate taxes, whether that's property taxes, transfer taxes, what have you. These things are a way of sharing in the wealth that has been gained through property ownership by some, but not others. It's not to say that people should not gain anything from home ownership, but at the end of the day, the gains from home ownership and from property ownership generally are often, unfortunately, not really creating wealth, but transferring it from renters to owners and from younger generations to older generations, which I don't think is our goal. Taxing underutilized property, not just empty units, but empty or underutilized land. This is a favorite of mine because not only does it generate revenue, but it actually encourages redevelopment of underutilized land. And so we're getting both the supply and the subsidy benefits simultaneously. And investing in public land and acquiring it where necessary. Something I've really taken away from many of our podcast episodes with folks from overseas is just how different the US system is in terms of land ownership, where in many European cities, for example, 20%, 50%, 80% of land is municipally owned. That will never be the case, and I'm not advocating for it here in the US, but there are real advantages to having some amount of public land ownership and the kind of stewardship that goes along with that for an entity, a city or county that intends to exist for all time. Something I've learned, particularly after writing this book and talking with folks over the years about it, is that people can be tempted to accept one or two of these priorities, maybe one they were already kind of in support of anyway, and rejecting the others. But I prefer that folks think of this supply, stability, and subsidy approach as a three-legged stool. And something where, it's sturdy and resilient when all the legs are in place, but remove any one and the whole thing topples right over. Supply without stability can mean over-concentrated development in just a few places that leads to unnecessary displacement and disruption. Supply without subsidy means that poor or otherwise struggling households are still left behind because the market will not always provide for them without some kind of assistance. Stability without subsidy or without supply is ultimately managed decline. It is not progress. Stability policies are great in many cases for treating the symptoms of a dysfunctional housing market, but you also have to treat the underlying cause, and stability policies are not usually great for that. Subsidy without supply is really a recipe for endlessly increasing costs. In some ways, this is the story of where I live, Los Angeles. And it's why after spending a few $1 billion over the past 5 years to address homelessness, we are now in a place where we have more homeless residents than we did before. And the cost of building a 400 square foot supportive housing unit has gone from about $350,000 to really, I would say around $600,000 per unit. Meanwhile, subsidy without stability is going to lead to many people needing assistance who might not have needed it otherwise. As people live with less security and predictability, they ultimately rely more on public support. So that's the three S's. That's supply, stability, and subsidy. This is really all in my book in different forms, maybe talked about in different ways. I've kind of rethought how I think about some of these things, but that's the main thrust of the book itself. As I said, there are over 50 policies and strategies to consider in there, and I'll leave folks to read the book for themselves if they're interested in digging into those in greater detail. But I did want to talk about some new things here and how my thinking has evolved since 2020 and where the research stands, what new research has come out or is being worked on, particularly, here at the Lewis Center at UCLA, the things that we're focusing on these days. So, one thing that really stands out is that the research supporting the essential role of supply just keeps rolling in particular, the role of market rate housing and the value it offers. I think it is very common for people to say, of course, we need more supply, but we need the right kind of supply. We only need affordable housing. And I will just say that the research does not bear that out. Market rate housing helps. It is expensive because new housing is expensive, but it really has impacts across the market. And the real benefit to market rate housing, which does not at all need to take the place of affordable housing, is it doesn't cost anything in terms of public resources. We just need to allow it to happen, and we will get the benefits from it. And it actually can generate additional revenue for us that can fund the affordable housing that we also certainly need. So I'm just sharing a couple things here, one from the Furman Center at NYU, another from us at the Lewis Center, summarizing a lot of this research, particularly from just the last several years, as our understanding has evolved and as the quality of the data analysis we're able to do has improved. Next up, this idea of broad upzoning is being tried out, and it seems to be living up to its promise. So the theory behind broad upzoning, which I wrote about in this publication on the right, is that if zoning reform is widely dispersed, if you're creating additional capacity across entire cities, across entire counties and regions, then you don't have this problem where landowners gain huge leverage to command a premium on their parcels because they happen to own, one of the few parcels where much higher capacity is now allowed. Instead, we can upzone without that land value uplift, as some people call it, and actually pass those savings along to the future residents of those new homes. It also means that we can attract smaller developers into this market where you don't have to be a developer with decades of experience, with millions of dollars in resources, with political connections to get a project through the approval process and development process. You can be, some siblings with a contracting business. You can be a dentist with some extra money, and you can invest in small projects that add to your community incrementally. In practice, we've seen some promising results here. Auckland, New Zealand, upzoned 75% of its city way back in 2016. The result was a real significant boom in housing production. Rents and home prices stabilized relative to other large cities in New Zealand. And what we saw was kind of the best of both worlds, where land prices climbed on underdeveloped parcels where we actually want those properties to transact and be redeveloped, and higher prices helps encourage that. But on the other hand, parcels and properties that were already quite heavily, intensively developed saw their prices fall. So housing that already existed that didn't need to be redeveloped got more affordable. Closer to home in Spokane, Washington, I just bring this up because this is probably the most ambitious housing reform I have seen at the city level in all of North America. They upzoned 2/3 of their city, increasing housing capacity by by my estimates, at least 600%. It's a city of around 200,000 people, 100,000 homes. It now has capacity for well over 600,000 or 700,000 homes, and almost every residential parcel in the city, which again is about 2/3 of the city, allows up to 3 stories, very minimal setbacks, no density limits, unlimited FAR, no parking in many instances. This has just gone into effect this year. So in terms of production, we will see where things go. But in terms of prices, some people might have told you that that scale of an upzoning would have caused prices to skyrocket. And what we saw is actually that prices have been falling all over the country because of interest rates and so forth, but they actually fell faster in Spokane than in other Washington cities and the state as a whole, instead of climbing. Another thing we've been able to do very recently, which surprisingly had not really been looked at before, was quantify some of the benefits of by right approval processes in juxtaposition to discretionary processes that are more subjective and unpredictable. So Los Angeles, through its transit-oriented communities program, implemented a by right process for some transit-oriented developments, and those projects were approved faster and with less variation than similar discretionary projects, which saved time and money. And also, interestingly, this new program required affordability, a set aside of a certain number of units at below market prices. And these TOC projects actually have higher rates of affordability than those projects that were discretionary and took longer to be approved. And so this idea that you have to have discretion in order to get community benefits, I think is being proven wrong to some extent, which is a positive thing in my view. In terms of my own views on these things, on rent stabilization, I have become more pro. And part of the reason is that as important as housing supply is for affordability, I continue to think it is the most important thing we need to address. The world can change much faster than homes can be built. And the COVID-19 pandemic was really the best possible example of that. What we saw in many markets is rents rapidly climbed, and then 20, 30% in a year, just insane, unprecedented increases in rents. And then a year or two later, they fell back down pretty significantly. Rent stabilization, if it had been in place in many of those places, it wouldn't have put anyone out of business. Landlords would not have had to shut down, tear down their buildings, leave them empty. It just would have smoothed things out. We would have ended up at a similar destination and prevented a whole lot of misery along the way. I think especially as we move to remote work, hybrid work, digital nomads, all these kinds of things, it's just getting very easy for people to pick up and move, and for demand in a given neighborhood or city or region to change very abruptly. And so I think we need these kinds of policies to, again, smooth out some of that change, give places time to have that supply response that you just cannot enact quickly enough in all cases. On the other hand, I've become more anti-inclusionary zoning. I'm ambivalent about it in the book, I will say. I think, as with most policies in the book, the design really matters. And I'm, careful to say that when you make inclusionary zoning programs voluntary, and when they are paired with offsets to increase density or floor area or reduce parking, they can produce a net benefit. Sorry, I did not actually fill out my reasons for anti-inclusionary zoning here. It's just the same thing. I apologize about that. But you can just listen to me instead. But ultimately, with inclusionary zoning, I've just come to the conclusion that it may be a useful bridge policy, but it is not, in the long run, the costs probably outweigh the benefits. And I have a publication coming out very soon in partnership with the Turner Center at Berkeley that's modeling the impacts of different inclusionary zoning requirements right now in Los Angeles to take advantage of that transit-oriented communities density bonus, you have to provide about 10% of your units to extremely low income households. There are other options as well, but that's the most commonly used. And because of state reforms and housing targets, there are people considering increasing these requirements as a means of producing more affordable housing, which is we have specific targets for those in addition to overall housing targets. And what I find in the modeling of this is that, for one, there are diminishing returns to increasing these requirements. You gain less and less below market units, and you lose more and more market rate units. What I find is that if you increase the inclusionary zoning requirement from 11% to 25%, you basically lose around 70%, more than 2/3 of all housing production. And while I cannot predict exactly what the rent impact would be, what I am able to say is that if that reduction in total housing supply or future added housing supply led to even just a 0.9% additional rent growth above what we would already predict to happen per year, that the benefits to low-income households of those below-market units would be completely abolished, completely overridden by the increase in rents to all of the other renters across the city. And a 0.9% increase per year incrementally when you're losing 250,000 housing units is not hard to imagine. And so I think we just have not really fully grappled with the costs of inclusionary zoning just yet. And I will say, because I'm sure there are many folks who work for cities and are tasked with finding ways to produce affordable housing. The reason we have inclusionary zoning is because we do not have the resources elsewhere to produce affordable housing. At the end of the day, whether it's produced publicly or privately, below market units are expensive. They cost as much or more to build as market rate units. The only difference is that they receive subsidies to keep their rents down below profitable levels. And so, we have to find some alternative here, given the restrictions on how we can raise taxes and fees and so forth. Cities are really hard pressed to find alternatives. And I do think this means that there needs to be a greater role for state and federal funding of these things so that we can get more of the private construction that we need and then keep prices down so that when we buy and build housing with vouchers and low-income housing tax credits and other sources, we're getting as much as we can from those in terms of having low rents, having low land costs, and so forth. Sort of on that note, I've become much more pro-state intervention. And this is definitely something I talk about in the book, but just, my views have gotten even stronger on this. And I think it's fair to say that they have for many state elected officials as well. So this is not limited to Western states, but I think Western states like California, Washington, and Oregon and Montana have really led on this and have passed major housing packages, in many cases that include both stabilizing policies like rent stabilization and eviction protections, supply policies like ADU reforms and upzoning and missing middle housing packages, and also subsidies to provide for permanent supportive housing, affordable housing, and so on. These reforms, I think it's very important to say that they follow decades of inaction, or at least insufficient action on the part of local jurisdictions. They're not coming out of nowhere. Local jurisdictions do not like them. They do not like to lose this control, but they had a very long time to do something, and the vast majority of them did very little. I think one of the reasons I really stand behind state intervention, state mandates, is that in matters of supply, stability, and subsidy, these mandates and similar programs, they ensure that every jurisdiction meets a minimum standard and that everyone contributes. You don't have free riders. You don't have people opting out. There is really no other way to get that outcome. Another reason that I didn't write down here, but I think is really important, is the politics matter here. And being a pro-housing, pro-reform, pro-tenant local official is a really hard thing to do. People get voted out of office for taking those positions all the time at the local level. At the state level, I have not seen that. For whatever reason, taking these positions as a state legislator just does not seem to, you don't seem to pay the cost in the same way. People seem to accept it. And so I think, beyond the kind of tangible benefits of this approach, I think there's also a political reason to have more of this decision making taking place at the state level. At the same time, I do think, it's important to acknowledge that cities really still do have a role, particularly as test beds for innovative policy. States need to scale up effective housing policies, but it's in cities where they're first evaluated, and we find out whether they're effective or not. Just in the California legislature, as an example, we've had density bonus reforms, we've had approval streamlining, we've had parking requirement abolition. All of these were inspired by local examples, cities that had done it first. And folks like me, frankly, relied on the positive results in those jurisdictions to point to and say, look, all of your concerns did not come to pass, and we got more housing, we got more affordable housing out of these reforms. And that is a big part of why they became state policy. I think this is the last note I have on sort of learnings and what I've been thinking about. So this is more of an open question, and I'd actually love for people to, suggest ideas or what they may be doing on this. I think infrastructure is a really underappreciated topic in housing policy and housing reform. And at this point, I just have more questions than answers. I worked on a project with the city of Reno, and I made some recommendations for them. But to just summarize how I'm thinking about this issue, when suburban developers are building greenfield communities out on, undeveloped land that no one's ever touched except maybe to, grow some crops, we require them to build all their infrastructure, the water, the power, the roads, everything. And I think that makes sense because all of that infrastructure is really for the residents of that community and no one else. Unfortunately, we apply really a very similar model when people want to build housing in an infill context in already developed communities. But the reality is that replacing or upgrading existing infrastructure is a benefit to the whole community. Actually, most of the benefit is the rest of the community because there are thousands of people that may be making use of that infrastructure in some way, and the new building accounts for a very small share of it. And on top of that, a lot of times this infrastructure, especially with sewer and water pipes, might be over 100 years old. It needs to be replaced or upgraded anyway. And suddenly, because a developer came in, the city has had that liability taken off of their budget. There's no accounting for that right now. And these requirements are more costly and they're inconsistent in infill contexts. Many times a developer will not know until they've started building what the Department of Water and Power is going to require of them. And if they don't know, they have to budget for a whole lot in their pro forma. And if they cannot afford what they might be charged, even if that charge is unlikely, then that project may never happen in the first place. So I think we're really losing out on a lot of housing because of an outdated model for infrastructure provision in infill contexts. And again, this is just something that I'm really thinking about that I think deserves a whole lot more attention now that we're kind of getting a greater handle on other issues like zoning and building codes and things of that nature. I want to come back really quickly to the podcast just to note that almost everything I've talked about here, we have at least one episode on. Episode 5 is on market rate housing. Episode 45 is on Auckland's upzoning, so on and so forth. Definitely check it out if you're interested in following up on any of these or any number of other housing issues. The last thing I want to say here before taking as many questions as I can is, I've been thinking a lot about how we tell the story, how we communicate the need and the value of housing reform. I don't have all the answers on this by any means. There are people much more talented than I at communicating this to folks, but I just want to make some thoughts clear here, or just share some thoughts that I've had that I think have resonated with many people. One thing is sort of on the negative side, laying out the negative case for doing nothing. Doing nothing does not prevent change. It just keeps us on our current trajectory. And I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate that if we don't build housing, if we don't change our policies, things will stay as they are. That's just not the case. And so making that as clear as possible, I think, is really important. If you don't build this housing in your community, it's just going to be built on the outskirts. And all those traffic concerns you have are actually going to be worse because those people, instead of living in your community, maybe driving a short distance or walking or biking, are now going to drive through your community after driving 30 miles down the freeway. Learn what motivates people and speak to their interests. What's amazing about housing policy and housing reform is whatever your interest, the right reforms can advance those interests, whether it's affordability, access to opportunity, racial justice, mobility, economy, health, environment, all these things, they can be moved forward with good housing policy. And so, understand who you're talking to, understand what they care about. And it's not being deceptive to focus on that thing when making the case to them. It's just speaking to their interests. And last, I said you need to kind of make the negative case for why doing nothing is a problem. But as always, the positive case is going to be the most persuasive. And one of the things that I like to say is that if you have a problem with, a lot of people want to live in your city and prices are going up and there's all this pressure to grow, yes, that's a challenge. There are always challenges. But compare that challenge to the problem of a Rust Belt city, a place that has had a declining population, that is losing businesses and residents. And it is frankly such a blessing to be a resident in a place with the problem of too much demand. You have people who want to be your neighbors. Your kids want to stay in your community. People want to invest their time and money and attention into making the place you live better. You can shape that into something in a way that a declining or stagnating city really has so many fewer options. And so I think really emphasizing the positive story is essential and a great place to start with a lot of these conversations. So with that, I will turn off the presentation, I think, and I am happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane, for that very interesting and informative presentation. We have a lot of questions to get through.
I see that.
Just a little bit of housekeeping throughout the webinar. We've been assembling the questions from your audience, and so we will get to them now. As a reminder, you can still continue to submit questions through the chat, and we will continue. Shane, if you are willing, we could go a little bit past, say 10 minutes over to try to cover a lot of the questions.
Sure.
That's entirely up to you. So let's get started. Starting off with a simple question that seems rather important. Would you share an example of a stability policy?
Yeah, so I think the quintessential stability policy is rent stabilization. And, I mentioned it in the presentation, but I think it warrants maybe explaining what that actually looks like. So I use the word or term rent stabilization in juxtaposition to rent control, partly just because rent control has a bad rap, but also because I think there is a meaningful distinction here. So rent control, the way a lot of people think of this is the classic, like New York, 5-bedroom apartment that someone's lived in since 1970 is still renting for $400 a month. That's a very uncommon form of rent control or rent stabilization these days. What is much more common is to say, once you move into a unit, your rent can only go up by some amount. It might just be the inflation rate for that year. It might be 75% of the inflation rate that year. It might be inflation plus 3%. Whatever the case, there's a kind of predetermined limit on how much your rent can go up each year. It's in many cases intended to still be enough that the landlord's not, falling behind or anything like that, but you at least know it's not going to go up 20%. And you can kind of budget ahead and have a sense for where things are headed. Importantly, when you move out, the landlord is able to reset the rent to market rate. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but the long and short of it is that when rents are controlled between tenancies, you end up with a lot of problems that we've seen everywhere from New York City to Mumbai, India, with vacancies, sorry, ask to close my blinds. Is that for me? uh I can close it in just a moment. But yeah, with vacancies, with conversions to condos, with black markets, key money, those kinds of things. So rent stabilization is a really classic one. And the last thing I'll say on it here is just that it is not the solution for housing affordability. It really should be treated as sort of a stopgap, which is not to say that it can't exist in perpetuity. But if your affordability strategy is just rent stabilization, it's not going to work in the long run. It has never worked in the long run to produce affordability. It really should be seen more as a stabilizing policy at the household level, rather than the economy-wide, market-wide level. Here, I can close the blinds here to get a little light out. An improvement a little bit.
I think that was meant for me, but I've lowered them as
I
far
see.
as
Yeah,
I
that makes more
can.
sense.
I have a question here. You mentioned that it's often more effective to pass policy on a state level. And one question that was asked is, when setting policy at the state level, you often end up with rules that work well in more urban, dense communities, but may not translate as well to suburban or more rural communities. Do you have any thoughts on bridging those gaps, and how do we create policies that work in all types of communities?
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. And I guess I have maybe two answers to it. The first is I do think that there's actually some benefit to standardizing things a little more than they are today. Every single community has its own zoning rules, its own approval processes. And I think actually having everyone adhering to similar processes to some extent is a good thing. And so, kind of just want to state that up front. That said, I think, like it may be appropriate where every parcel or many parcels in the city of Los Angeles should allow 10 units per parcel. That's probably the scale of zoning reform we need here in a city where something like 70-80% of residentially zoned land currently allows only one home, excluding ADUs and things like that. The same cannot be said for many suburbs and certainly rural areas. You don't need that kind of density. Some kind of reform is probably valuable in many of these places. But what I've seen, and I think is a reasonable way to approach this, is having sort of different rules based on city size or certain, geographies and so forth. You might have a very common policy I've seen is if your city is under, say, 25,000 people, then there's this set of rules that tends to require, more density than they do now, but more incremental. And then larger cities, maybe 25 to 100,000 have different rules that go a little further. And then larger cities than that require even more. And I think that's a reasonable compromise where you're still getting some consistency from city to city in places that are similar to one another, but you're still allowing for some variation at the same time. One other thing I will say that I think that Montana has done and a few other places have done that I think is worth considering is giving a list of reforms that cities can make and requiring them to make some number of them, but being able to pick amongst them. So I don't remember exactly the numbers. in Montana, but I believe they had a list of about 15 reforms, things on parking, on impact fees, on approval processes, on density, and saying, here's 15 things. Every city has to pick at least 5 or 6 of these. It's up to you which ones you want to do, but everyone's got to do that many. And I think that's another way to, allow for a little more customization and also just more kind of local input within the constraints of that state mandate.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On a similar note, recognizing that the housing supply must be increased, should we be quick to approve large lot sprawl development in locationally inefficient places? Does upzoning large parts of a town where there is public infrastructure while downsizing on the outskirts of town hinder or support affordability?
That's a really good question. And I honestly, I go back and forth on this. I think in practice, the only thing we've done is allow those large lot, suburban, poorly connected developments, and done much less to actually promote infill. And so, there's pretty strong evidence that green belts and other kinds of, urban growth boundaries have had negative impacts on affordability. But again, there's no reason that has to be the case. It is possible to have reforms that encourage infill, that offset the loss of capacity you might have at the fringes. The only reason I hesitate is just understanding that we tend not to be very good at that. But I think as an ideal, that is absolutely the direction we want to be moving. I think where I have some wariness is like, let's make sure we allow the urban infill at a sufficient scale first, make sure the policies are in place for that before, or at the very least at the same time as we enact those green belts and urban growth boundaries and so forth. If we're going to do the growth boundaries and then, hope that we get to the urban stuff later, I think that's where we can get in trouble.
Right. Great, thank you. Another question has to do with environmental issues. How do we grow sufficient housing stock without degrading natural resources like water, green spaces, wetlands, etc.?
I think partly this just requires a lot more intentional planning. This is something that Nolan Gray, another Island Press author of Arbitrary Lines, really talks a lot about and has kind of shaped my thinking to a great degree. Planners nowadays are very focused, like almost all planning seems to be on what can people do with their private property and what can't they do. And we've sort of lost sight of what do we want our public spaces to look like and where are they headed? And I think really changing that paradigm back to focusing on the public space and the public rights of way really should be a priority. So, just thinking about this issue of, parks and open space in particular, there's no particular reason that a single family neighborhood, just to pick a especially challenging example, couldn't over time redevelop into something higher density. And at the same time as you're allowing, instead of 1 unit per parcel, you're allowing 10 units per parcel or just larger apartment and condo developments, setting aside half a block or a block of that space amongst, a dozen blocks and saying, over time, we're going to turn this into a park and we're going to have more people and we're going to have more green space. It's just going to be more shared rather than private green space. That's the kind of direction I think we need to be going. And I think you really have to have more kind of forward-looking and visionary plans than we have now. And you really have to think about the community as a whole, not just what each individual property can do over time. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to evolve a neighborhood into anything other than, maybe that one 7,000 square foot parcel can become a local community park. But I think people want something more than that. On infrastructure, water resources, the environment generally, have to say that infill development, just broadly speaking, is good for the environment. Every home we build in a city on already developed land is a home that doesn't need to be built and is less likely to be built out in a green field on, wild land, on agricultural land, and so forth. I think that's like the long and short of it is that's where we need to be building the housing. Something I learned just a few years ago on many of these resources too, and this is not going to be the same story in all places, but in Los Angeles, back when the city had 3 million people, which was 30-ish years ago, perhaps, we used the same amount of water total as we do today, with 4 million people. So we've added 1 million people and our water demand has not increased at all. In fact, I think it's declined a little bit. That's not per capita, that's total water demand. So our per capita use has declined very significantly. That's partly just efficiency, which you're going to find everywhere. But to some extent, to a great extent, it's also densification, and less use of water for watering lawns and these kinds of things, which is a huge, huge share of urban water. So I think recognizing that urban infill in particular is very often pro-environment is at least part of the answer to this question.
Great. Thank you. Would you see a problem with eliminating zoning altogether and using other means of mitigating negative externalities and unintended consequences from new large-scale developments?
No, I don't really see a problem with it. Houston has never had zoning and they still regulate uses and they still have development standards. Again, this is much more Nolan's wheelhouse. This is really like the heart of his book, is this point that you can still regulate what gets built, and you can still control noxious and disruptive uses without zoning. Zoning doesn't actually is not needed for that, and actually it's done a very poor job historically of achieving that specific goal. What it's done a very good job of is creating kind of monoculture neighborhoods, of keeping out certain kinds of people from certain kinds of neighborhoods. And I'm not as much of like a zoning abolitionist. I don't think it's necessary to get rid of it. But I do think if we were to get rid of it, there are many other rules and regulations and policies that could achieve the same things without some of the downsides and just with less complexity generally.
Great, thank you. I can report to everyone that we are working on getting Noel, who wrote Arbitrary Lines, to come back and do a future webinar. So stay tuned. In your research, have you observed state and/or municipality willingness to loosen the restrictions on tiny houses? And do you see micro housing as a viable option of addressing the housing shortage that we face? The questioner says, this seems like a more reasonable solution when considering affordability to younger generations who are interested in home ownership.
Yeah, I think there's room for everything at the end of the day. I think a problem we've had in the US, and I don't think this is unique to the US, is we've had, movements over the years that are mostly well-meaning. We don't want flop houses, we don't want single room occupancy hotels, we don't want this and that, because it's just not a high enough quality of life. We shouldn't support these things because we should expect better. And to some extent, I agree. Like I at least get the motivation behind that. The problem is we make the cheap thing illegal, but then we don't provide the resources to make the nicer thing affordable or accessible or even abundant enough that people could have it if they wanted and had the resources for it. So I think bringing back some of these more affordable options and letting people choose. Like I say this about micro units all the time. Would I, at almost 40 years old, live in a 300 square foot unit? No, I would not. It's not for me. It's just not appropriate. I would not enjoy it. But someone who just moved to the city, just graduated college, someone who has the option of either living with roommates in the city or living at the suburban edge alone, or living alone in a micro unit in the middle of the city where they can kind of use the downtown or whatever neighborhood as their living room. If we didn't build the micro units, then people still have those other options. If we did build the micro units, if people chose to live in them rather than those options, those alternatives that still exist, clearly they are making a choice for themselves that that is the best option for them at that time. And I don't really think it's our place to tell them that this option they would prefer over their alternatives should not be legal. Obviously there are, there are limits to that statement. I'm not saying people should live in unhealthy or hazardous conditions, but that's just not what is on offer with things like micro units and tiny homes and so forth. These are just small places, and many people, given the option, would prefer a small place that they can afford to a large place that they can't. So, places that are doing this, I know some have. A lot of this seems to be, I've seen this outside of Austin. We actually have tiny homes, sort of in Los Angeles, but in Los Angeles in particular, it's much more of like a homelessness intervention. I think, in the long run, I hope that we can just have enough housing abundance that like getting an 800 square foot home rather than like a 300 square foot tiny home is affordable itself, and no one has to accept less than that if they don't want to. But again, like, we're not there right now, and I think we need to just let 1,000 flowers bloom at the moment and just see what we can do for people and what works best for them, and keep building up that supply over time, so that if we do feel like certain options are just not what we want for people, what we expect or believe is sufficient, then we actually are providing alternatives for them.
Right. Are you aware of any good examples of state level legislation that focuses on housing stability? In California, for example, they have had years of legislation focused on supply, but have not seen equivalent investment in subsidy and stability. Are you hearing anything out there in the housing world?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would dispute that characterization of California's reform. So on the supply side, we've had ADU reform, which has been very impactful, but very much an incremental policy at the end of the day. We've had stuff like SB 9, which allows people to split their single family lot into two and build 2 units on each, but that bill is so laden with conditions that almost no one has used it. We've had bills that have required cities to plan for more housing, but thus far that has not actually led to much. So we haven't done that much on supply. There's still a lot more to do. And then when you look at subsidy and stability, on subsidy in particular for homelessness, we've spent over $20 billion over the last 5 or so years as a state. I think that's just state money, to say nothing of local funds as well. So there's been a lot of money going to that also, much more than just about anywhere in the country. Not to say that it couldn't be more, but it is significant. And then on stability, I would say the 2 big things that have happened are a very like admittedly weak rent stabilization law that is more characterized as like anti-gouging. It's basically rents can't go up more than inflation plus 5% or 10% per year, whichever is less. And so given the high inflation rates of the past few years, 10% has been the cap. A 10% rent increase for a lot of people is unaffordable. I want to be like very plain spoken and clear about that. At the same time, it is binding in many cases, and it means that many households that are having their rents increased by 10%, this last year would have had their rents increased by 15 or 20 or 25% or more. And it is really helping those households a lot. At something that came alongside of that anti-gouging rent stabilization law, which is AB 1482, I think in 2018 or 2019, is just cause eviction protections. And so those are also now statewide, and really only, I think, in both the rent stabilization and just cause eviction protection laws, I think they apply to housing that's at least 10 or 15 years old, probably only multifamily, which is very common for rent stabilization nationwide. But those are very significant laws where effectively, if you can continue to afford paying rent, once you sign a lease, you are pretty much able to stay in that unit for as long as you like. And that is something, again, that most cities, most states, you cannot say anything like that.
How do you thoughtfully balance expediting development processes with considering vulnerable residents in the area? And this question made me think of an example here in Baltimore where an affordable housing proposal went through in a formerly industrial area that is directly across the street from a 3 million square foot Amazon warehouse. And when I heard about this proposal, I asked the question, aren't we just putting them in a future environmental justice situation? Because on one hand, you want people to be able to walk to work if they work at Amazon. On the other hand, you're putting families across the street from a major truck facility on a major truck route with, potential air and air quality issues. How do you balance those needs of finding land to produce additional housing with also protecting the health and welfare of residents?
Yeah, that's a great and very difficult question. But, the first thing I would say is having enough land that is zoned for this kind of development is really important. It's that broad zoning reform idea. When there are only a limited number of places of parcels where multifamily housing is legal, which again is the case in most cities in America, and it tends to be a relatively small share of parcels, then you got to take what you can get, right? And so I'm sure the affordable housing developers had no ill intentions in proposing there. It's just, if you have a city where there's 1,000 parcels where you can build affordable housing and only 5 are for sale at any given time, like, what are you going to do, right? So making sure that there are just a lot more parcels where this kind of development is legal is a really important thing.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, we have to ask why did the zoning allow something there specifically in the first place? And I think, we can talk about political power and racial dynamics and these kinds of things about why multifamily housing was allowed in or near that industrial zone, but not allowed in healthier areas, in more central areas, in more job-rich communities. I think the reasons for that are pretty well documented. But yeah, I don't think there's a short-term answer to this. I think it really comes down to making sure that our plans reflect the values that you're talking about, and that we're not waiting until something is proposed to then start having these fights, because it's chilling to all development in some respects, whatever its merits, to have projects where a developer comes in with something that is compliant, presumably, that the zoning and other standards said, hey, you can build this here. And then they show up and say, I want to build that thing here. And then there's an outcry. And I'm not faulting the people for raising concerns about this at all. It's just to make the point that we need to kind of go up a level higher and really look at the rules that are directing people to these places rather than other places. And I think that's the place to start. I think just generally speaking, we need to spend a lot more time on the community and city level planning process and engaging as many people in that as possible and getting the best possible outcome there. And then, to the extent possible, not having to have these fights on a project by project basis where, not only is it harder to mobilize support, but also it's just so many more resources. The process is often weaponized by wealthy communities. That's kind of the flip side to all this. Is this sounds like a very valid concern by the folks talking about this project near the Amazon warehouse, but more often than not, the opposition is actually from wealthier neighbors when a project is near them, and they're able to really weaponize this process to stop housing that, by I think most of our values is really something we would celebrate.
Right. Can you provide further details on the by right approvals? Does this refer to flexible zoning provisions that would negate the need for additional planning approvals? Or is there specific strategies that are involved in order to speed up the process?
To an extent, this is going to be, jurisdiction specific because everywhere has their own processes. I think a few key things are objective standards rather than subjective standards, so that it's essentially a checklist approach where a developer and the people reviewing the project know very quickly whether the thing they're proposing is compliant or not. And if it is, it essentially goes straight to the permitting process. That's sort of the ideal. Having really no public hearings on projects, I think, is really important. Again, this is not to eliminate community input. It's saying we need to have that community input at an earlier stage where we have much more widespread community involvement and buy-in, so that we don't get to the point where individual projects can be vetoed by just a few neighbors when you had hundreds or thousands of people who participated in and contributed to the plan overall. So those are two things. I think another one, to the extent that decisions do need to be made, whether objective or discretionary, or subjective or objective, or discretionary or not, having some kind of shot clock, as it's sometimes called, where if a decision is not made within a certain amount of time, it is automatically deemed approved. This is just a way of ensuring that projects aren't just held up in limbo indefinitely, which is often a strategy that cities will use for, or individual planners or politicians or whomever will use for holding up a project that is otherwise is completely compliant, but if they can never get a hearing and a decision is never made, it's effectively, rejected. So those are just a few ideas.
Right. Have you looked at ideas that might help weak market cities, for example, legacy cities in the Midwest that might be losing population, as you mentioned earlier? I guess across the board policies that may help, where quality is more of an issue than quantity because the population is declining and there may be vacant units, they're just uninhabitable. Have you looked at any examples that could be shared about helping those types of cities?
I will admit my focus is much more on cities that are kind of dealing with too much demand rather than too little. I do think that I think finance needs to be a really big part in a part of the solution in cities with kind of stagnating or below peak populations, where you have this problem of oftentimes the cost of renting is actually higher than the cost of buying, but people can't buy because of unstable incomes or low credit scores or repair liabilities, and they can't get the loan for the renovations. And so I think the finance side of this needs to be kind of built out more. And I don't know if that's a role that cities on their own can play. I think it probably has to be at least at the state level, if not the federal level. to really kind of align those interests, because so many places are in this position where renters are paying too much and they would be better off if they could own, and the city would be better off if they owned so they could make those repairs. So no one's winning in the current situation. So bridging that gap, I don't know what that looks like, but I do think that really needs to be part of it. I will say also, places that are, have deindustrialized, that are below their peak populations, I think they do need to think about their future, and, if and when things turn around, what it's going to look like, and kind of take advantage of the fact that if they do zoning reforms now, nothing will probably happen all that much. And that's actually a good thing in some ways. It gives you some political freedom to just do the things that, kind of prepare you for the future, even if they will not have immediate impacts necessarily. But I do think, kind of missing middle zoning reforms, allowing accessory dwelling units, these smaller incremental scale things, not only can they sort of set you up for future success, but I think to the extent that they do generate some renovations, some production in the near term, they're going to help you also start to build up that labor force that can work on not just building an ADU, but renovating an older home that really needs, like a gut rehab or whatever. I think the labor supply issue is a really important part of this. And of course, it's kind of doing double duty, where it's having folks who are improving the housing stock, but also generating economic activity that can help your city grow and kind of build up the economy too. So I think those are small or maybe hopeful ideas that could be considered.
Great, thank you. A couple of people have mentioned the idea of taxing the land at a higher rate than taxing the improvements on that land, as a way of sort of encouraging both maintenance of existing housing units, because a lot of people, especially those who are renting out units, may forego improvements so as not to increase their tax liability. So if the taxes are falling largely on the land, is that a way of encouraging the production of new units on vacant land, as well as encouraging the maintenance and quality of existing units throughout this area, whether it's a small town or a city?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I've thought about and read about land value taxes for a very long time, which is essentially what is being talked about here. But, not necessarily only taxing the value of the land, but just maybe a greater percentage tax on the land than improvements, kind of shifting things in that direction. The way that's normally talked about in expensive cities is this is a way to kind of capture economic rents, in the sort of like academic sense of the word rents, where people are just collecting money that they didn't actually do anything to earn. They're just getting because they have a monopoly on that land, and that land happened to get more valuable because of kind of community level and economic investments and so forth that they didn't have much to do with, if anything. So, and that in turn can encourage people to make better use of underdeveloped land if you have a vacant parcel and so forth. I hadn't thought about how this could work in cities with, aging housing stock, with limited demand, but I do think that's really interesting to the extent that, making those improvements is a disincentive to, because you're going to pay higher property taxes. If you're kind of focusing the taxes more on land, it's almost like an implicit subsidy for making those renovations. And I think that sounds like a really positive benefit. I know that I think it's Detroit is considering a land value tax, or kind of making this shift toward taxing land at a higher rate relative to improvements. And I haven't read a whole lot about it, but now I'm thinking this might be part of the reason why they're considering that.
Great, thank you. There are so many questions. Are there reports or research that you could reference for the utilization for by right solutions, secondary dwelling units on single family lots, showing costs versus benefits?
I don't know exactly what this would be showing. I think what I can say is that California has, and you could actually go to the what's it called? California Housing Defense Fund, used to be called Carla. Uh, they have a guide. I think it's just called a guide to single family zoning in California or something like that. It, despite the name, it's basically about the history of ADU reform in California. And it's extremely interesting to me because it shows how ADU reform, it was 2016 that we passed laws that kicked off the giant increase in ADU production statewide, where we went from like 100, maybe a few hundred units a year statewide to now we're at 20,000 per year. And it was really 2016, 2017 was the turning point. But we passed our first ADU law in California in 1982. And we passed another one every 4 or 5 years until 2016, just chipping away. And it was just never enough. It was never really getting to the heart of the issue. But all of which is to say, like, there's also in the post 2016, 2017 era, there have been many follow-up reforms to make ADU production easier, to expand eligibility, to allow for larger projects, all these different things. And in addition to not requiring parking, minimizing or even eliminating the ability of cities to charge impact fees, but also streamlining and requiring that many of these projects be approved by right. All of that has happened here in California. I don't know what an analysis looks like. I think at the end of the day, if you're eliminating fees, then there's a very clear cost, right? To you're not able to use those fees for whatever infrastructure needs or service needs you might have. And at that point, you're just making this decision as a policymaker that the benefits of the additional housing supply outweigh that cost. When it comes to streamlining and by right approvals, there's not really a cost. I can't really think of one. I think people sometimes make the argument, not just with ADUs, but with housing production generally, that discretionary processes allow for negotiation, and that negotiation means that cities can get more in one way or another out of housing developments. As I said, our research in the city of Los Angeles shows that's not always the case. I think being very clear about what you expect from new developments is another strategy for getting quite a bit. And in some ways, the city of LA saying, we're going to make it easier to get a project approved, but we're also going to require more than we would of another kind of project is a way of balancing those things. I think that's maybe one way of thinking about this. I guess the only other thing I would say is discretionary approvals, fees, etc. These things are a barrier to all housing production on the margins. For someone who's like a homeowner who's never gotten a permit for anything, who has no idea how to deal with the city and probably never will again, having them go through a process that is similar to a developer building a 100-unit apartment building is madness. It is a guaranteed way to just not get much of anything built. There's just no way around the fact that you have to make the process very simple for small scale projects, because the cost of going through a discretionary process is divided by the number of units you're building at the end of it. And if it takes you a similar amount of time to get a 1-unit project approved as a 100-unit project approved, which is the case in many places, the kind of benefit at the end of the day of that 1 unit is never going to justify all the cost and time and expense of going through that discretionary process. It can work, for larger projects. Still isn't really necessary in many cases, but it can work. It just doesn't for smaller projects. And so I don't think there's any way around needing to go a by right path if you want any kind of meaningful level of production of very small scale projects.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll wrap up because it is getting late. Would you just review a little bit more about upzoning and share additional information about what that might look like? And if you could share that slide again, that might be difficult, but finding that slide, if you could, just talk about upzoning and give a little more information about what that might look like on a policy level that people could take back to their communities.
Yeah, so I'll just share some things rather than pull it up because I can probably share some things in addition to what was listed there. So I think there's a few things to consider. One is, there are places where large scale projects, whether that's, for your community, 5 stories or 50 stories, whatever is big for you, every community has some place where big stuff is appropriate. And so, that's often commercial corridors, it's downtowns, it's job centers, et cetera. Allowing those things in those locations, I think, is valuable. What a lot of cities have done and are increasingly doing, which I think is important to do, especially in light of kind of declining office demand, is allowing residential uses wherever commercial uses are allowed. Many cities already do this, but more are adopting it all the time. Really, AB 2011 in California has kind of institutionalized this statewide, although there are lots of requirements attached to it, so it's harder to use than a local policy might be. But more broadly, so you don't want everyone to have to live on a busy street that may be more polluted. It might have great transit, but it's also noisier and maybe less safe to live on. You also want people to have the option to live on side streets, on less traffic streets, which is where most of the land is in almost every city anyway. You can't keep that land off limits. And so that's this broad upzoning idea. And there you don't have to go to the same scale. In Los Angeles, I think a appropriate broad upzoning scale would be 3 to 5 stories on these, lower density side streets. In a suburb, it might just be 2 with, limited setbacks and pretty high lot coverage. So you're getting kind of relatively big buildings, but not a lot of bulk and scale necessarily. The idea there is, in addition to bringing into the development market people who have traditionally been excluded by, the wealth that they have, by the connections they have, et cetera, but also that missing middle scale, anything from a 4-plex to a 12-unit, 3-story apartment building. This is sort of the sweet spot for affordability. In particular, you're able to divide the land costs among multiple households, but you're still able to build a building that is pretty much all built out of wood, which is the cheapest thing to build it out of, that in many cases may not require an elevator, which is very expensive. Parking may be able to be built either at grade or at worst in a kind of half underground level. So all of these things are reasons for supporting that kind of development and allowing it in many places. And as I said, if you're zoning enough of your city for that scale, you shouldn't really expect land values to climb in the way that you would if you were to upzone a single family home to suddenly allow a 10-story building. That parcel would become very valuable all of a sudden. But if you do this kind of lower scale but everywhere reform, that's kind of an alternative strategy here. I think there are different strategies for getting these upzonings done. They can be density bonuses where, in exchange for providing some affordable units or other public, or private amenities, you're able to build higher, more density, more floor area, lower setbacks, et cetera. Those are a few things. I'll probably just have to direct you to my book for the rest, though.
Thank you so much. And we usually like to end by asking you if there's anything else you'd like to say, if there's anything you wish we had asked about that we didn't. Just some closing remarks from you.
I don't think I have much to say. I'll just remind folks, if they do want to pick up the book, it's The Affordable City. It's at Island Press, and you can get a 30% discount with code SMART. But I'm happy, I love getting questions because it helps me think about issues in different ways and kind of get the context of different places, because I know the same policies don't apply the same ways everywhere. So if anyone wants to reach out and ask a question, have a conversation, happy to do so. You have my email right there.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone for their really great questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them. There were over 100, so there was no way without, staying here all day to answer all of those questions. But thank you for coming and sharing your questions with us. This concludes our webinar, The Affordable City, Supply, Stability, and Subsidy, Lessons since 2020. I would like to offer sincerest gratitude to Shane for joining us today and for sharing his work on this important issue. Thank you to everyone who attended and to John Coleman, who helps make our webinars run smoothly. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. When you exit today's webinar, you will also be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience. Those who requested a certificate will be receiving them by email following the webinar. Please keep an eye on your email box for details on future webinars sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network. Thank you for joining us and have a great day. Thank you.